Hello. In this recording of our Justia webinar, Love at First Argument, Using Psychology to Sway Jurors, Jake McKenzie explores the surprising ways juries make decisions and how skilled litigators can use psychological principles to connect with jurors on a deeper level and strategically influence decisions to strengthen their cases and outcomes. Remember, if you'd like to see more Justia videos on law practice and legal marketing, be sure to subscribe to our channel.
Thank you, Nina. Hey, everybody. My name's Jake. Excited to talk to you about applying psychology to trials. And, you may be asking right off the bat, like, wait, psychology, help me out here. Psychology, a lot of people believe, is the science of how people think and the science of decision making. And of course, that is what we're trying to do with a jury, is get them to change their way of thinking to align with what we want them to believe and to give us a specific outcome, a verdict. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'll go ahead and give you the headline right now out of the gate. So if you end up zoning out, you'll at least take something away. Decision making doesn't function like you think it does. And that's because we were all educated at a time when people really had a poor understanding of how decision-making occurred. I'll give you an example of that, and we'll start with just a broad story. A little bit of a history lesson, at least for those of you that are younger. Some of us paid attention in real time. Back in the early 90s, President H.W. Bush was dealing with the situation in Russia. Now, you may recall that his predecessor, President Reagan, had convinced Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev to open up the country, to get rid of communism, to move to a market-based economy and shift things over. You may also remember that it went kind of badly. There were food lines, there were shortages, there was civil unrest. And the Communist Party, who still ran things at the time, said, hey, we've had enough. We're going to undo this. So they found someone else to lead and become president of Russia. Now, the man they chose was Boris Yeltsin. Again, a name I'm sure you remember. Now, Boris Yeltsin, you probably don't know, was one of the most dyed-in-the-wool communists that has ever existed. He joined the Communist Party when he was 3 years old. He became head of his local village-based Communist Party when he was 14 years old and rose up through the ranks. And he was known for being a strident communist. I believe in everything that we say, and we're always going to default in that direction. So his job was to undo all the things that Gorbachev had done. And President Bush, who was in the second half of his tenure, decided something bold. I'm not giving up. I'm going to convince the most dyed-in-the-wool communist ever that capitalism is actually a better way of doing things. And it ended up becoming one of the greatest sales jobs of all time, of changing someone's beliefs and then ultimately their behavior in doing so. And the story of how it got done is really fascinating. So he did, as you might expect, he brought Yeltsin over to the U.S., and began by trying to persuade him. And they started in Midwest to show him our industrial might, to show him how far advanced the U.S. was in terms of our manufacturing capacity. Then they went out to the West Coast to show him our military might and how much further advanced our Air Force and Navy specifically were than the Russian military. And they ended up in Houston, where they showed him our scientific might, Johnson Space Flight Center down in Houston, to show him how much further advanced we were in the sciences, specifically the space sciences. And all this was intended to illustrate that capitalism is a better system than communism. Now, what's interesting is none of this changed Yeltsin's mind. And that's probably not surprising. He had really good spies. He might even known more about our capabilities than President Bush did. They knew all of this. And so we went through the motions, and he finishes his tour of Johnson Space Flight Center, and, nothing has changed. But he did change his mind on the trip. And this is where it gets interesting. Leaving Johnson Space Flight Center, they were headed back to Houston to catch his flight. And he got thirsty. And getting thirsty changed the course of history. The only place at the time to stop and get a drink at that time was not fast food, because it was before fast food was everywhere on that route. It was a grocery store. So the Secret Service wheeled him into a grocery store to stop and get a drink. And he decides he wants to go in with them and see what this is all about. And when he does, his mind is blown. More array of food than he had ever before seen in his life. And he is absolutely certain that this is a CIA setup. No, you're tricking me. I don't believe any of this. This is a intelligence operation. I insist that you take me to some more grocery stores. So I end up stopping at 2 more grocery stores on the journey back, and he ends up talking to people. And he's thinking to himself, well, let's meet the people running this. This is probably your PhDs, the highest level of society. And no, the store manager, I think, had a college degree at one of them. At another place, he had a high school diploma. And these are just normal people. Well, he wants to talk to people that are shopping there. And surely this is the elite of your society if you're giving them access to all this glory and wonderful food. And he talks to them, and no, they're school teachers and moms and farmers and laborers and blue collar types, just normal, average, everyday Americans. And he's blown away. And after he stops at several, he realizes this could not possibly be a CIA plot. They would not have gone to this exercise to set up several different locations to trick him. So he gets on the plane, and on the flight back, he decides, I am wrong. Communism has failed, and I've got to change over to capitalism. And very specifically, he revealed in later interviews, he spent most of the flight thinking about his grandchildren. Specifically, he did not want to do to them what had been done to his generation, that they didn't have access to this type of food and other resources that the average everyday American had access to. And it was visualizing his granddaughter that got him to change his beliefs and behavior. Now, the lesson from this that you probably already surmise is that we make decisions emotionally, not rationally. Now, the reason this is interesting is because what does law school teach us? Well, it gives us several years of a hyper-rational education. Let's take arguments and make them as logical as possible. We've got to write brilliant briefs that are logical as possible. We've got to talk to judges in a logical way so that we can win that level of argumentation. But yet, when we get in front of a jury, logic matters, but not nearly as much as making emotional connections. And that's where we're going to launch today. We're going to take that general premise and figure out how we can be better at making decisions in ways that persuade jurors. So with that, let's dive in a little bit and look at love at first argument and take a look at how irrational jurors can be, but in a predictable way, and how to affect those outcomes. So we'll start with a little bit about Intermark Legal. We consult in the trial industry, and we do 2 primary things. Number 1 is help clients understand that target audience, understand the jury pool, and what do they walk in the room thinking and believing about this topic. And then 2, how can we organize your case, this information, so that they digest it and then shape their beliefs in ways that will help us achieve the desired outcome. Very simple. And it leads us to several different things that you're probably familiar with, from market research, online research, focus groups, mock trials, and a heavy dose of argumentation structure, and really helping you to simplify the case so that you can understand what people are going to relate to and what they're not, so that you can make the best use of your time. And we know that this methodology has been wildly successful in achieving some huge case outcomes. And I'm going to be happy to talk about some of those when we get to Q&A. Now, as we go through this, I'm going to describe how irrational jurors are, but in ways that we can affect them. Be thinking of ways that you would like to tap into this knowledge and dig in a little deeper. All right. So the challenge I'm going to start with is illustrating that it's not just jurors that are irrational, that we're all irrational. This is a fundamental human trait. So we're going to begin with a group exercise. Now, we're on a webinar, so I realize you can't actually respond, but you can respond in your head or even say it out loud. So we're going to start by asking you some simple questions. Who are the market leaders in a handful of categories? And I'll warn you, these are not trick questions. So we'll give you the first one, acetaminophen. If I ask you who the market leaders are, you probably said, oh, that's Tylenol. I've got that. No problem. All right. How about the next one? Who's the market leader in bleach? Yep, that's right. It is Clorox. And how about for aspirin? Yep. Bayer. That is correct. Now, all 3 of these products have 3 major things in common. The first one I have given you, they are all market leaders and commanding market leaders at that. Most of us struggle to even come up with anybody else that sells any of these competitive products. The second thing they have in common, I will also give you, they are price premium products, and a commanding price premium at that, led by our friends at Tylenol, that averages almost a 500% price premium over the generic on the shelf next to it. And neither of these things surprise you. But the third thing that they all have in common ought to jump off the page at you. I promise you, you know what it is, but it's so obvious you may struggle to come up with it. I give you a moment to think. All three of these products are commodities. And what I mean by that is they are required by law to be chemically identical to the products on the shelf next to it. In fact, we have a subdivision of the FDA whose sole purpose for being is to test these and other products to make sure the chemical composition does not change. If you change the chemical composition of acetaminophen, you can't call it acetaminophen anymore. Same thing with bleach and aspirin, salt, bananas, and there's lots of other things that would fall in commodities. But wait, what's happened here? We're buying something that we know is identical, but we buy it in droves and we pay a massive price premium for the privilege of doing so. Economists would tell us that is highly irrational behavior. Yet that makes sense to you and I. So what is going on here? Well, it has to do with how we make decisions, and this does greatly affect how we argue cases. And it starts with this simple premise. It doesn't work like we think that it does. There's not one decision-making system in the brain, there's two. Now, Dr. Daniel Kahneman, who is a psychologist, won the Nobel Prize in Economics a little over 15 years ago, in essence, for this one slide, for illustrating there's not one decision-making system, there's two. And he was a psychologist that won the Nobel Prize in Economics. And aside from, I'm sure, pissing off all the economists, it was a revolution in our understanding of how people make decisions. Now, if you're like me and you had an economics class in college and you asked them, well, how do people make decisions? Microeconomic theory taught all of us, well, people are rational actors. They will achieve the best outcome and get the best value. And if you can understand what the rational outcome is, you can predict how people are going to behave. And the good news is the system does exist. Kahneman called it System 2. I want you to think about it as the slow system. This is when, if you want to think about something and apply resources to it, structure your case, you will sit down and think through it, and you will come out with optimal outcomes. But here's the kicker. Kahneman also illustrated that we hate using this system. In fact, we take great pains to avoid using this system. Why, you may ask? Well, it's because it is effortful. And what he meant is it burns literal calories. Over the course of the day, about 20% of your entire caloric burn is just going to be spent in thinking. Now, if you're like me, you wish you could dial that up and avoid going to the gym, but we can't. Because we are so concerned about that huge caloric burn, we take great pains to not think unless we feel like we've got to. And when we do force ourselves to think, it's exhausting. And you have certainly experienced this. You spend it all day working on a case. If your head of the firm comes in and says, hey, I need a presentation put together for a new prospective client, you will sit down and you will use System 2 to come up with the best level of argumentation that you can. It'll be super logical. It'll be brilliant. And when you get done, you're going to be wiped. Absolutely spent. And it's because you've burned all your resources thinking. You probably remember this back in college, or if you've got kids that are in college age, you probably notice around exam times, it's a bunch of zombies walking around campus. And yes, certainly a part of that is because they stayed up all night cramming, but part of it's because they're trying to employ System 2. They're thinking a whole lot, and it burns resources. Now, the implication of this is the brain doesn't like to think unless it feels like it has to. We save these times when we force ourselves to think. The rest of the time, we use this other system that Kahneman called System 1. I want you to think about it as this automated system. Now, here's what's interesting about System 1. Most people are unaware that it exists, nor how that it functions, or that it's functioning at all. And the way it works is very simple. If I were to ask you any question at all, System 1 will suggest an answer. Is this what you mean? And the vast majority of the time, we grab that answer and go, yep, that's exactly what I mean, and we're going to run with it. And the way it works is simple. If I were to say, hey, why did you wear that shirt today? Well, it's not a major decision, so you probably didn't use System 2 thinking about it. You used System 1. So you walked into your closet, and likely you looked around and thought, well, I've got a meeting, I need something formal, and I grabbed this. And you gave it very little thought. It was automated. You were on cruise control in making that decision. Now, what's interesting, if I were to ask you in a public forum how you made that decision, all of a sudden it changes. You don't really remember how you made that decision, but you will feel pressure to answer in a way that tells me what you think I want to hear, or that makes you sound smart. Now, that's interesting. We don't know how we're making decisions, but we feel a pressure to rationalize those decisions. And that's a critical piece of understanding. We make decisions first, and then we rationalize them after the fact. And we even see that in neuropsychology. We hook people up to EEG machines and we ask them to make decisions. We can see them making decision down in the kind of brain stem, the very primal, highly emotional area. And then we rationalize it after the fact. Sort of like Yeltsin decided to get rid of communism. It was a very emotional decision because he was afraid of what he was doing to his granddaughter. And then he rationalized it after the fact. And it took less than a year for him to overhaul his decision and to shift the trajectory of Russia. So the other piece you need to understand here is System 1 dominates. Well north of 90% of every decision that you're going to make over the course of the day, you're going to allow System 1 to make. So when we are arguing a case, we need to be appealing to System 1. And that means two things. We work on programming System 1, and we need to understand its existing decision pathways and appeal to those pathways so that we help people make simple decisions. Now let's breathe a little more life into that. I've got one more point that I want to illustrate. So again, group exercise. If I were to ask you very quickly, what is 2 plus 2? You would have said 4. Great. No surprise that you got the answer right, but what you may not realize is you didn't do the math. No one did the math, and it's because you've been programming System 1 that 2 plus 2 equals 4. In fact, we started programming that when we were 3 to 4 years old, and we've reinforced it. Now, had I said, do not come up with this answer, you would have been unable to, because that's not how System 1 works. It is going to suggest this answer regardless of whether or not you want it. And it's a great example of how System 1 works. I pose a question, your brain immediately gives you an answer without you having to think. And that's a great example of how we appeal to System 1. Now, I'll give you an example of how System 2 works. If I were to ask you instead, what is 17 times 12? Oh, you just had two very different thoughts. We'll start. I'll go ahead and give you the answer. The answer is 204, so we don't stress anybody out with math. Your two thoughts, though, were, I know how to do that, quickly followed by, but I'm not going to. And it's okay. We're on a webinar. I can't see you. I don't validate whether or not you're actually doing the math. But what's interesting when we do ask in a public forum, nearly everybody opts out of doing it. Now, I can usually tell if I could see you who's doing the math, and it's because your pupils dilate a little bit. You will look up into the bright, and most importantly, you become cognitively blind. You can't take in any more information. You would have stopped listening to me. You stopped paying attention on the screen, and you can't pay any attention to anything else while you're doing the math. But only a few high achievers do the math in this exercise. We find that somewhere in the range of about 95% of people will just continue listening, even though they can. All of us on this call know how to do this math, but we chose not to. And there's a critical lesson in this to those of us that are in the litigation industry. It's this. It illustrates a law in psychology called the law of least effort. And what the law of least effort says is that you will stop thinking about anything at the first opportunity you think you can. So if you have a question to resolve, you're looking for the simplest way to stop thinking about it. And it kind of goes back to that System 1, System 2. System 2, our thinking burns resources. We don't want to burn resources. And so we've developed this way of making decisions, and we're looking for simple answers to complex questions. Now, I'm about to blow your mind, because there's a corollary to the law of least effort that's really critical to understanding. And it is this. The more complex the question that I ask you, the faster you will stop thinking about it. Now, I want you to process that for just a second. The more complex the question, the faster you will stop thinking about it. Now, I suspect that if I had asked you that question before, you would have thought the answer was different. Shouldn't it be the more complex the question, the faster or the more time we will give to thinking about it? And the answer is no. The brain doesn't like thinking. It's looking for simple answers to complex questions. So I ask you, think about your last case or the one that you're working on now. Is it complex or is it simple? In fact, I rarely come up against a case that's not fairly complex, even things that are seemingly very simple on the surface. We're asking jurors to digest different levels of information, lots of evidence or lack thereof, assumptions, data, expert witnesses, lots of information we're going to throw at them, and we expect them to take it all in, to process it, and think about it. But this illustrates that they don't want to do that. They're looking for simple answers to complex questions. And that's what we've got to do. The primary job of a litigator is to take the complex and overly simplify it, to give them permission to not have to think about it and to feed them information back. So if this is all you got from today, you're very successful. This is the major takeaway, but it has major implications. So let's dig in a little bit on juror psychology and what we can expect of people walking in the courtroom. Well, step one is understand that it's highly irrational. Now, this is a study that came out this past year that probably won't surprise you, that they tracked the attractiveness of lawyers. They had them rated separately online to see how their trial outcomes went against less attractive competition. Not surprisingly, attractive lawyers got better outcomes. They won more cases. Now, will it surprise you if I tell you this included bench trials? Would it surprise you if I also told you that this affected judges' resolution on their motions? It did. Even when it was a jurist making the decision, it wasn't a jury, attractive people still got better outcomes. And it's because system one is influencing our decisions in the background. Now, this applies in lots of spaces to the irrational juror. I'll give you another example. If I were to ask you, how good of a driver are you? Put yourself in one of these categories. If you are one of the best drivers on the road, say the top 25%, you're D. If you're one of the worst drivers on the road, you're A. So go ahead and put yourself in a category real quick. Now, I will tell you, when we ask this question to the public at large, if I were to run an online poll so that you could see it, we'll find about 80% of folks put themselves in D. They think they're one of the best 25% of folks on the road. Think about that for a moment. That math doesn't math. 3/4 of us can't be amongst the best 25% of drivers on the road. So what's going on here? It's the egocentricity bias. And the egocentricity bias simply says that we all think that we're above average at stuff. And this applies to lots of things. There have explored this through every question imaginable. People think they're better leaders, athletes, thinkers, processors, friends. They think they're better at digesting information, coming to correct conclusions, and that they do above average work. So what does that say about our jury pool? Well, they're going to think that they're above average at these things, so that when you present information, they're going to think they understand it and are better at this. The question is, are they or do they? Well, we also know something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, the Dunning-Kruger effect, you probably remember from various conversations, and basically it says the less you know about something, as a general rule, the more you think you're good at it, or the more you think you understand it. And the Dunning-Kruger charts very regularly across every topic that we tested against. So if somebody has very low competence on something, they often think, oh, this is pretty easy and understand it. And the more they learn about it, they go through a process where they're like, oh, I don't understand this at all. And the real experts will tell you this is super complicated and I'm not sure I've really got it down. So think about that in terms of the expert witnesses that we're putting on for our case and how it's being processed by the jury. You take these two things, they're going to think, jurors are often going to believe, oh, I already understand this and I'm smarter than everybody else. I don't have to pay a whole lot of attention. So they can tune out and not give credence to our experts. And that's a problem. I'll give you an example thereof. This is another one from pop culture. There was several years ago where a fast food chain, A&W, decided they want to compete head-to-head with McDonald's. McDonald's, of course, has a famous quarter-pounder cheeseburger, and they were crushing it with this. And A&W said, you know what? We're going to come out with a bigger burger, and we're going to price it exactly the same. We're going to do a third pounder, and we're going to price it exactly the same. They did this massive ad campaign advertising a third pound burger for the same price as the quarter pounder. And guess what happened? Quarter pounder sales actually went up. They did not gain any market share on McDonald's, and in fact, McDonald's sales went up during that intervening period. And so they tried to figure out what was going on. And what they found is that the average American, when they heard 1/3 versus 1/4, that the 3 is bigger and therefore, or excuse me, the 4 is bigger, therefore the quarter pounder must be a bigger burger. They thought the quarter pounder was bigger. Now, is it that most of America doesn't understand how fractions work? No, that's not how it means. What it means that they process information in ways that sometimes lead to irrational outcomes because they're not used to dealing with fractions on a regular basis. And thus, changing how we present information has a great impact of how people process that information. So jurors think they know a lot. think they're experts at things. They think they're above average, and they're going to process information in ways that make it tricky even for them to understand what it is you're trying to get across to them. Last piece of one of the things you're going to be wrestling with on a regular basis is called the false consensus effect. False consensus effect is one I know you're familiar with, and what it says is this: I think that everybody thinks like I do. Well, why is that? Well, we're egocentric beings. Like, we think we're really smart, and therefore other people presented with the same information will come to the same conclusion. So jurors are thinking, I understand this. I've come to a conclusion very quickly without thinking. I don't have to pay attention anymore. And I also believe that everybody else on my juror pool is going to think like I am. And what we have is a recipe for jurors to stop paying attention to us. And I know you've experienced this. If you've gotten a trial outcome, you talk to some of the jurors afterwards and you ask them about the evidence presented, and they will tell you something that was not at all what was presented at trial. It was not the conclusion our experts were trying to get across to them. And what we're hearing are these principles in effect. They didn't listen, they thought they knew, and they didn't process it in a way that we wanted to affect them. So these are the issues that we're all dealing with. So what do we do with those? How do we present information in a way that becomes more relevant? Now let's shift into that. And it starts with having a great understanding of what we're dealing with. So we're strong advocates of doing some juror research before you begin. Even if this is a small case, you could afford to do an online survey for a few $100s and get an idea of what the jury pool is walking into the room with. The second thing you want to do is make sure you are prepared as soon as you open your mouth in front of a jury. Now remember, simple answers to complex questions, and everything you say or do, from the way you are dressed to what comes out of your mouth, affects a juror. And for most of us, the first time that we get an opportunity to do that is in that jury questioning phase where we're in jury selection. Now, most litigators I know either give very little prep to this or think they're already good at it and don't have to think about it a whole lot. So let's think about what's going on during that phase and really illustrate how we can use this step to begin shaping the outcomes of the case. So we begin by doing juror research. I want to understand what they walk into the room thinking about this topic, whether it is a car crash or PFAS or something very technical. They walk in thinking or having heard about some of this or not, and you want to understand what that is. Then, from the moment you open your mouth, you are shaping what they think about that topic. Thus, every question you have influences their perception of that. Now, some of the psychology principles you will see at play here. One is that jurors are wildly different. And even if you're trying the same case in different venues, you'll get different outcomes. So it's critical that we understand what jurors are coming into the room with. So across one dimension, collectivism versus individualism, this one dimension of how they process information, it varies wildly just across the U.S. And most of us think that most folks in the U.S. are very homogenous. This also varies from urban to rural and from county to county, just across one simple dimension. Thus, how they view the moral equivalency within a case often changes by the jury pool. You need to understand what that is. You need to really understand the jury pool related to the topic at hand and how they're going to process that information. You can get at some of this with surveys, even better with focus groups, and even better with mock trials. So start by understanding what they are walking into the room believing before you ask your first question. Then when you ask your first question, understand there's something called the commitment principle. And the commitment principle says this: as soon as I make a decision, my brain rewires itself to think that that's a brilliant decision. If I do this verbally in a public forum, it gets locked in. Now, wait a minute. How and what are we doing during this juror selection process? We typically start by asking them questions. As soon as they give an answer, they begin locking in those opinions. Now, I'll give you an example of how this affects all of us. Oop, wrong direction. Chances are you've been in this circumstance where you've got to go into a room with your peers and make a decision. Maybe it's a legal decision. Are we going to argue the case this way? Are we going to take this case? Something else. If you're the one that has to make that decision, my advice to you is shut up. Do not offer your thoughts on the topic until everybody else has spoken. Because as soon as you offer your thoughts, you start rooting for your opinion to win, and you lose the ability to be unbiased about what the outcome is. So great decision makers bring in groups of people, they let everybody else weigh in and make their arguments, and then you are free to make whatever decision you want. But Jurors don't have that. We're asking them a specific question. So we ask them if they feel one way or the other. As soon as they make a decision, they're locking themselves into that belief system. And their brain literally rewires itself to think that that opinion that they just offered is right and valid. And we will have difficulty changing that opinion. So be very careful about how you frame the question about your case. Because often from that very first question of we're locking in some of our jurors' opinions of the case. We're removing their ability to change their minds. So be careful about what we ask. One related way we can do this is something called the yes principle. The yes principle simply says this: if I ask you a series of questions, every time you say yes as an answer, it increases the likelihood that you will say yes to the following question, regardless of what it is. Now, that's a bit crazy. It always blows my mind every time when they reproduce this research. But chances are, if you've gone to buy a car, you were familiar with this, chances are you went in just to check out cars. And also the salesperson approaches you and he's like, hey, it's a beautiful day. And you're like, oh, yeah, it is. Man, a lot of these cars are awesome, aren't they? Yeah. And soon he'll ask you, well, like, hey, if we could get the price low enough, could you see yourself getting one of these cars? And you think, well, yeah, that seems reasonable if I got a screaming good deal. And soon you find yourself sitting at a desk negotiating the price of a new car when you never intended to be there. And they're leveraging the yes principle. We can do the same thing with jury pools. If we want to lead them to an outcome, we want them to say what we want them to say, because remember, that changes how they process information. We do this through the yes principle. We structure questions in a way that leads them to say what we want them to say. And we can do that by asking things in a yes-no framework so that they end up agreeing with the statement that we want them to agree with. And as soon as they do, it changes their own wiring to believe that that is a correct and positive outcome. Do not go into this phase without preparation. We cannot do it on the fly. It is difficult to think through where we want people to end up. Thus, planning on this phase affects trial outcomes far more than most litigators think they do. All right, enough about that. Plan going in, have a structure for how you're going to get them to say what it is you want them to say, not just think about how am I selecting and finding folks to strike, which is, of course, is important in a lot of trials, but how am I shaping their beliefs about this case? The second thing we want to do is the more obvious and probably the thing you spend the most time on. How do I structure this monstrosity of a case in a way that is going to change beliefs and behavior? And again, all that training that you got as in law school actually makes this more challenging because this is a non-rational process to be good at. It has to be emotionally driven and has to mirror how people make decisions. So let's dig into that a little bit and talk about some of the psychology principles that can help us be better at this process of what goes into a case. So we'll start with the premise that language matters. When we dig into synonyms, we're often lazy with them. We pick ones that we like or don't like because of our own language, and we don't think about how it affects people's perception of those. I was in a case not too recently where they wanted to present something related to the opposition as being a front group or a proxy group. And they weren't sure what to call those things. And what we found is that even though those are synonyms in the dictionary, we process this in very different ways. One of them has very positive connotation. A proxy group is viewed as providing aid, whereas a front group, meaning the exact same thing, connotes that there's something nefarious going on. We're manipulating the situation. And thus, from the perception of everybody else in the room, it conveys a moral designation against that group. And we see this in politics a whole lot. Really good politicians are really good about using language to shape our beliefs and behavior. I'll give you another example of this. If I were to ask a group of Americans, like, hey, are you in favor of more assistance to the poor? And then I ask another group of Americans, are you in favor of welfare? Now, you already know the outcome of this, but I want you to think about the very question. What is the definition of welfare? It is, by its simplest definition, assistance to the poor. But we process them in very different ways because the words carry additional or different emotional weight to them. And the differences are stark. 70% of America is in favor of more assistance to the poor, but less than 30% of America is in favor of welfare. They mean the exact same things, but language has power. Stop and give great thought to the key components of your case, because we are conveying information, including moral information of how you should process this defendant, this witness, this plaintiff, by how we talk about them. So give thought to the language that you use and be disciplined about using it repetitively. Because one of the principles of advertising that applies in trials as well is repetition wins. They're not going to remember the vast majority of what we present in a case. So we've got to be selective about what they remember. Thus, being disciplined about our language and making sure we have high levels of repetition helps us get to better outcomes with jurors. Another thing we're going to wrestle with is that people don't process facts in the same way. In fact, there's a principle called the misinformation effect, and this goes back to how we use language. So they did this study. They brought folks into a room and showed them a video of a car crash. Now, everybody saw the exact same video of a car crash. And they asked two different groups questions. The first group was asked, how fast were the cars going when this accident occurred? And they had them write down an estimated miles per hour. Then they asked a second group that saw the exact same video, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? So changing the word from crashed to smashed led to different outcomes. That probably doesn't surprise you. The difference was stark, a 25% increase in perceived speed. Now think about that. They all saw the same video. We're all getting the same level of information. Changing one word of the question changed their objective perception of reality. Language matters. We do not give it enough thought in trials. It not only affects how we process moral information, it can affect how we process rational information, including such things as perception of speed or what I happen to see in a video. Give thought to your language. Another related example of this is something called priming, how we expect people to process future sets of information. So to give you an example, let's say a defendant in a case is a corporate group. Now, corporate groups can be processed in lots of different ways. Depending on if you are the plaintiff or the defense, you may want to process in different ways. We want to prime the jurors with this. Some priming can have people think about a corporate group as a group of individuals that are there trying to feed their families and provide a good and service to America. We're just trying to make money, and that's a very positive construct. The same priming can get us to think about corporations as money grubbing out to seek the most enterprise. People believe both sets of things. Neither one is objectively true or false, but the language you use and how we prime people about this entity will change how they process all information about the entity. What happens is they will literally ignore information that doesn't fit this frame of reference, and they will pay extra attention to evidence and testimony that reinforces this frame of reference. The language that we use not only affects moral judgment, it affects our rational perception of objective facts, but also, and perhaps most importantly, the information that we choose to pay attention to and the information we choose to ignore. Now, that's critical. Because remember, they're not going to remember the vast majority of information we throw at them. So we've got to be disciplined about making sure that we're defining the information that they pay attention to and how they process this. So we do that through paying attention to our language and making sure that we are using priming appropriately. So we tell them how to process information and draw those outcomes. And this helps get over some of those obstacles, such as the Dunning-Kruger effect, where they think they know it all, where they think they really understand a topic, and we lead them down a path. Now, we can take this a little step further through things that you're probably familiar with, such as narratives and stories. Now, you're likely familiar, the brain is hardwired for narratives. They ran a study in South America not too long ago that illustrated that people can remember much more information if it's structured into a story than we can if it is just simply given. In fact, for a little while, people thought they had stumbled across a secret to memory, and they thought they had found a subsection of South America with people with longer memories, and that was not the case. It was just a subculture that was dedicated to turning information into narrative structure. Now, the reason narrative structure is important is because it allows us to remember information, but it also tells us what to do with that information. It allows us to make emotional connections. It changes the information that we process. It allows us to change our perception and frame of reference for who we value that information from. It also tells us what we need to store and recall. I'll give you an example of this. If I were to start my introduction to a case by telling you the story about the wolf in sheep's clothing, think about that story. Chances are you can tell a version of the story. Even if you don't have small kids, you remember the framework of that story. But maybe if we change that story to the boy who cried wolf, wait, different moral outcomes. Now I have a frame of reference of what to expect. The boy who cried wolf will illustrate they had been warned before, but it wasn't true. Therefore, they have permission to ignore this information. It not only affects the information we process, but what to do with that information. And this is the challenge in most cases. We've got to take tons of complex information and we've got to structure it in a way that is digestible and gives instruction for what to do with that information. And stories and narratives are the most powerful tool we have at our disposal. Now, law school doesn't teach us that. Law school teaches us to present information in logical ways, to draw logical conclusions, but that's not how people process information. Stories give us a way of doing that. So, as you're sitting down with all the information you have at your case, we've got to figure out how to process that information. If we can turn it into a simple narrative structure, it tells them what you need to remember, what's salient, and has a moral outcome. It tells them what's the most important way to decide this case, because nearly every story that you have in your head has a morality tale baked into it. So it's not just what we remember, but what to do with that information. So spend a lot of time thinking about the language and the story that we're going to tell. If you get those two things correct, you will dramatically increase your win rate in trial. Now, closely related to that is understanding what it is that we present and realizing that other emotional cues have power. A lot of successful trials I have witnessed take those emotional cues and put them into visual reference. In one case, they showed that in a plane crash, the remains of the victims were delivered in a small box. So they brought a small box, used as a demonstrative, they left it on the table. And occasionally they would point to and reference it. And what we found is that the jurors paid an awful lot of attention to the size of that box, and it made them uncomfortable. It made them highly emotional. In another case involving a car accident, they brought the wallet of the victim and demonstrated that because it was a good visual reference to illustrate how powerful of a car wreck that it was. And again, jurors paid attention to it. It drew their attention to this item. And what ends up happening in the times where in all the testimony and they're zoning out, it gives them something to pay attention to, and it triggers emotional memories. So we take these things and put them together, disciplined about our language, how we structure the case into a narrative structure with a morality-based outcome, and then how am I going to reinforce that with things in the courtroom. All of us gives us a nice framework to beginning to elevate our win rate. Let's take that a step further, and we're going to introduce something called context clues. And this really gets at how we present information, and specifically when we have demonstratives. And what context clues are going to illustrate is that literally everything you put in front of a jury, they're going to use to process and make decisions. I'm going to show you some examples that are going to kind of blow your mind. We'll start with some simple ones. You guys might be familiar with this gentleman, Morgan Freeman, star of some recent Super Bowl spots. And as you read this, something interesting will happen. Yeah, if you're like me, you end up reading it in Morgan Freeman's voice. And it's because how we process information is affected by the things in our visual frame of reference. In this case, I simply put a picture of him in front of it. Your brain immediately started reading it in his voice. Now let's take that a step further. If I were to put this sentence in front of you, you're processing this at a subconscious level, and your autonomous nervous system begins going, oh, wait, maybe I do have itches and maybe I do need to scratch somewhere. And it begins to affect us. So it processes not just on a rational level, but an irrational level. The fonts that we use matter in addition to everything we put in front of us. For instance, if I were to ask you, hey, can I change the meaning of this by simply changing the font? And you'd think, Jake, you're crazy. There's no way. Well, we got the super sweet message. You'll always be mine. But if I change the font, oh, wait, process it in a very different way. Now, of course, this is a fairly absurd example, but I really want to illustrate that everything we put in front of a jury they use to process it in different ways and affects the brain at subconscious levels. This is one of my favorites. That's right. About 90% of us read this in the order that they expected us to. And it's because there is an order to how our brain is intended to process information. And this does vary by culture. So people in the eastern part of the world will process differently than those of us here in the US. Thus, all your art director friends who in college studied how to lay out information, they were learning about psychologically how we process information. And there are right and wrong ways about doing this. Simple things such as if we put a light font on a dark text, people will stop reading it faster. Did you know that? Yeah, absolutely true. So when we're presenting information in a courtroom, don't do that. Otherwise, you're telling the jury you can stop paying attention to what I'm presenting. And think about how we present that information. This really makes us understand that we're presenting complex information. We got to give more thought to it. Every chart and graph that you put up, we need to make it simple to process. Because remember what we learned earlier? Simple answers to complex questions, they don't want to think. So every piece of information we have that we're going to put in front of them, we've got to think about what we want them to take away and structure it in a way that that takeaway is mind-numbingly obvious and reinforces that priming and that story that we've already given them. So it ought to reinforce something that we want them to believe as opposed to prove something different. And that's very different. So we start understanding the jury, understand they're going to walk in believing that they are smarter and understand more about this topic than we want. We've got to overcome those things. We're going to prepare by doing some jury research. We're going to structure the questions that we have in that initial interaction of voir dire, and we're going to begin shaping their beliefs and behavior. Then we're going to think about how we structure the case. We're going to give it an architecture that ties into a narrative structure. We're going to lean into morality tales when we can, and pop culture examples. We're going to use storytelling to get them to remember what we want them to. We're going to be disciplined about our language, and we're going to give thought to the demonstratives that we put in front of them and the sequence of witnesses that we put in front of them. All this will affect what they remember and then what they do with that information. And if we do it well, we have a group of folks walking back into the jury room to deliberate in ways that we get better outcomes. But something happens in that jury room that if you have watched mock trials and you get behind the frosted glass and you watch them make decisions, usually strikes people. There's a different process that goes on here. I want to share some video research that gets at how this group decision-making process works and how it ought to affect our strategy for going into a trial. This has to do with what's called social pressure and conformity. This is a long study, and I'm going to play the first about minute of this. And I think you will be struck by what happens with this group decision-making.
The Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example,
the actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1. It's 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3. 3.
3.
The Ash experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we'll still go along.
Now, this is always enlightening. And if you've done mocks, you've probably seen this in action. Sometimes it's people come in having written down an outcome, whether it's a verdict or a recommended amount that they want to award, and then change that as soon as they hear what everybody else has done. And it's understanding that delta and realizing how we can affect it. And we affect it most, not only in how we shape the case, but in the instructions we give during closing. We ought to be giving the jury permission to believe, as we started earlier, that they think that everybody else thinks like them, and to be willing to share that information earlier and to believe in that set of information, which insulates them a little bit from the Ash effect. But it also means that we need to be conscious that this is going on, so that when we talk to the jurors about sticking to their guns and upholding what they believe is right, can be a way to insulate yourself from this effect. And then lastly, we can shape the jury instructions in ways that encourage group participation to allow them to come to consensus. Because this is an irrational process, and it starts, like we said at the very beginning, people looking for simple answers to complex questions. They don't want to think through things. And one of our large tasks is whittling that information down. And sometimes that means checking our own ego. And we see this a lot, particularly when you're dealing with a trial team that's got multiple lawyers on it. Lawyers will fall in love with their own witnesses. And hey, I've spent 40 hours with this witness doing depositions and shepherding them and getting their testimony right. And sometimes it takes an ego check to say, hey, wait a minute, the jury's not going to care what this person says. It doesn't affect their decision making, and being willing to let go of the investment that we have made. And sometimes it takes that outside perspective to realize this isn't going to be effective. This doesn't fit within our larger narrative, or that people aren't paying attention to it. They don't understand it and be willing to walk away from it. And that can be the value of an outside perspective. So at Intermark, our approach is to really understand how people make decisions. And we do that by understanding what your jury pool walks in the door thinking, then understand how we can change that beliefs and then ultimately the behavior. And we do that by shaping the information at hand, by selecting what evidence needs to make it in, what stories we tell, what language we use, and the order in which we present it. Then we make sure the demonstratives are very effective in reinforcing all those things. And then lastly, how we're going to close. The instructions that we send them back to the jury room with during those closing arguments, what we are asking from them is that capstone. If we do all of those things, you get better outcomes. The best trial lawyers have ever been around know all these things intuitively. For those of us that are learning, all these things are very learnable. It just takes a little bit of time to stop and think about it before we get into the trial room. We have a tendency to ignore these things or to punt these things because we're so busy with all the other things that have to happen, the motions, the submissions, getting all the depositions done, communicating to our witnesses when and where in logistics, that we forget to take the time to be persuasive. Persuasive starts with psychology. So we're about to shift into question and answer, but I want to remind you there's some fundamental things you can go through, including market research, message crafting, witness prep, jury planning, and even understanding what happened post-trial. You need to be willing to audit your own cases to find out the things you're doing well and the things that you can improve upon. Because hopefully you're going to trial many cases over the course of your career and you want to get better at it. Juries are irrational. That is your major takeaway. But they are predictably irrational. We can and do shape how they process information and the outcomes by how we choose to present that information. Now, this doesn't mean that we can get wildly different outcomes. We can't get people to do something that's wildly out of their norms. But what we can do is we can nudge. We can take a decent case and make it into a strong case. Conversely, people can take very strong cases and make them losers because they fail to do this thing. It's nudging around the edges by really understanding juror psychology. If you have enjoyed this, I would encourage you to do this. This is a QR code that will get you to sign up for regular sorts of jury psychology information where we review studies, we look at applications, and you'll sign up for, in essence, a newsletter where you just continue to get more information. I will be taking some questions today. I'm sure you've got some delicious ones. I would also ask that if you are a litigator, follow this link and join our research. We are doing some research about how litigators approach information and how they're presenting things to jurors, and we will be sharing this with all the participants at a future date. And so we'd love your participation in our ongoing research to make trial lawyers better at what they do. And then lastly, if we don't get to it today and you want to dig in a little bit more, here is my email address. Please feel free to send me an email or follow us at any of the social mediums. We're regularly putting out additional content related to the psychology of jurors and how to be a better litigator. But with that, I think it's a good time to pivot in our last few minutes and answer a few questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake, so much for your insight on how psychology can inform how to sway jurors and improve litigation as a whole. And with that, we can go ahead and dive into the questions. We've already got quite a few here. So, Jake, go ahead and go through those if it suits you.
Awesome. So thank you for the questions. I'm going to tackle ones that I think are probably most relevant to the group. And forgive me if I don't get to yours. All these are wonderful. So we'll start with one that says, can you share specific voir techniques that effectively leverage the commitment principle to secure early juror buy-in? Yes. The key to this is ask questions that get them to answer in a way that leans into our case. So be very disciplined about the question that you ask. So if I were to say, hey, are you hungry? That's very different than if I say, hey, would you like a hamburger for lunch? Answering I'm hungry may not get you to want a hamburger, but I ask if you want a hamburger and you might say, yeah, sure. All of a sudden you're committed to wanting a hamburger. Same thing is true in voir dire. Think about how you structure the questions and the sequence in which you ask the questions. You can't just start with, don't you want to support my client here? No. We got to lead them down a path where they lead themselves into saying things. And as soon as they say something, their brain rewires itself to thinking that it's true. So they'll be more likely to say yes to the following question. So by the time we get to asking them, isn't this a absurd situation in which we find ourselves where my client is on trial? All of a sudden they're going, yes, of course it is, because I've already said yes to all the things leading up to this. The punchline here is give thought to your questions in the order in which you ask your questions. Another good question is about the Dunning-Kruger effect and how to overcome the Dunning-Kruger effect. Answer is you cannot. It's hard to tell people that they are dumb. It's hard to tell people you don't understand about information. In fact, you want to lean into it. You want to make things seem obvious. So the more complex the piece of information, the more complex the expert witness testimony, the more energy we want to put into the preparation for that expert witness to simplify. Expert witnesses are tough. What we find in observing jurors, particularly in mocks, is they don't pay attention to around 80% of the testimony at all. Like they're not paying attention. They're zoning out. They're thinking about what they got to do tomorrow, what my wife told me to bring home after all this is over. What they do is they come to quick conclusions. So that first 30 seconds of that expert testimony is what they're going to walk away with. They might remember one or two things that reinforce that. Thus, you want to lean into the Dunning-Kruger effect. You want them to believe that this is a simpler topic than it is at face value and come to very simple conclusions out of the gate. You cannot change people's belief that topics are simple. We do not have enough time and resource to truly educate somebody about something, but we can't allow them to not think by giving them simple conclusions out of the gate. Outstanding question. Can you review how to practically identify and counteract egocentricity bias when presenting our case to a jury? A similar answer to the Dunning-Kruger effect, you can't. Like, I can't convince you you're not a great driver. I can show you the data and go, hey, not everybody can be a great driver. And immediately how you process that information is like, yeah, all those other people are idiots. I'm the great driver. Like, we just don't process that, hey, maybe we are closer to average or that this is tougher than I think that it is. Don't try to change it, lean into it. So, just like with the Dunning-Kruger effect, the way we shape information, the way we simplify things for people, and you can lean into it in such a way like everyone's going to come to this conclusion because as you heard from this expert witness, this is simple. He shouldn't have been going that fast. Or this is cancer causing. Simplify that and lean into how obvious this seems. And what the brain does, it goes, I knew it. I should have come to that conclusion. And because we haven't asked them to speak about it, they are willing to change their beliefs and behavior. And thus you lean into the psychological principles. Don't try to change them. Now, the good news is all of the ways we process information, we call them heuristics in psychology, are well known. They're all system one, and they're about 200 decision-making heuristics. You're familiar with a lot of them, like social proof and fear of missing out. Just give thought to those things as you shape your questions and the way we present information. Lean into them. Don't try to fight them. And that's how you get to be a great litigator, is by applying psychology in a disciplined way. It's not rocket science, but it does require you thinking about it ahead of time, and we can help you through that thinking. Great question. How we balance the need for persuasive storytelling with the risk of unintentionally triggering the misinformation effect? Great question. The misinformation effect is when people thought they heard something and they really didn't. It is going to happen regardless of whether you do this. What we do with storytelling is we increase the likelihood they pay attention to the one or two things that are critical to our case, whether that's as a plaintiff or as a defendant. And that's what you're trying to accomplish with the storytelling. You're also trying to bake in a morality tale. What do I do with this information? So these are the two pieces of information that are important from this narrative. And if I tell the story correctly, it is a morality tale. And now I know what to do with it. What do I do with the wolf in sheep's clothing? Well, I need to punish that wolf because he shouldn't have been there in sheep's clothing. Well, the boy who cried wolf, I know what to do with that. Well, I need to punish the guy who was telling falsehoods and not believe him now, even when he may be telling the truth, because that's a natural outcome of human behavior. It bakes in what to do with that information, and that's the value of it. They are going to misremember what our experts say. They're going to misremember what you say, but through repetition and structure, particularly narrative structure, we can help combat that so that when they walk into the jury room, they've got the 2 or 3 things we want them to remember. And folks, they're not going to remember a whole lot more than that because that's the frailties of human memory. Don't try to fight it, lean into it. All right. Another good question. In what ways can anchoring be strategically employed without appearing manipulative? Oh, brilliant question. Now, I get this question a lot. Is psychology manipulating juries? And I remind you, we can't radically change what people think and behave. If you got a terrible case, I can't turn that terrible case into a great case, settle that bad boy, or just get out of it entirely. But we can use these things to nudge people. Anchoring is a great way of doing that. So we don't have a good concept of math in our heads. If I were to ask you the question like, hey, how long is the Mississippi River? In your head, you go, I have no idea. Why would I remember that information? But if I were to put on the screen behind me here the number 500 and then ask you how long is the Mississippi River, oh, you now have an anchor. You will base your guesses off that random number because it is in your frame of reference. This is not to do with how we process information. It is a processing system of the human brain. We will use that information as an anchor. You need anchors in your case. If it is talking about damages, you need anchors. If it's talking about other factual evidence that we're putting in, you need to give them a frame of reference. We don't have a value for big, small, etc. So we use anchors to help them process information. So again, be disciplined. They will not perceive it, if they perceive it at all, that you have done that. They will just take that information and use it to process that information. And your opponent will likely be doing something similar. And that's when we give thought to the language that we use and repetition and story structure to make sure our anchors have a greater effect. Again, you're nudging people, not radically changing how they choose to end up processing information. Another good question. What extent does juror demographic profiling perpetuate stereotypes and biases? Oh, great question. And this is why we encourage research, because we're all terrible about understanding what other people believe, and we bake in our own biases. As I like to say, we're all racist. We just don't intend to be, and that's because we're hardwired that way. And the reason we do research is to overcome those biases, to find out what groups of people think. And what you're really trying to do with research is 2 things. One, understand as a group, what are they walking in the room already believing about this topic? And then 2, see how that varies by group. And what we find is that there's very rarely a racial overlay by itself. It usually has to do with a complex integration of factors, such as if you were a business owner, you'll have a tendency to process information in this way versus if you were just a lay worker your entire time. Understanding what those differences are allows you to be armed when you're going into the jury selection process, because a big part of your job is just trying to get the right jury makeup. I mean, you've heard this from lawyers your entire life. You get a good jury, you're going to win. You get a terrible jury, you're going to lose. So give thought to that. Try to be disciplined about that and identify these are likely to be the best jury groups we have. Then you do the things to try to persuade them in such a way, and that's the combination of which you get the best outcomes. You do have biases. A lot of those biases are correct. A lot of them are not. Understand that you have them and do the research so that you can overcome them. Follow the data, and the data is pretty obvious. But be careful about sharing those biases out loud, as we talked earlier with the commitment principle, because as soon as you say it out loud, your brain rewires itself to believe that it's true. So if you think there is a Trump effect affecting your jury pool, you will now look for evidence to reinforce that. Whereas if you instead were to say, hey, go do some market research and tell me what the jury pool comes in with, you'll now be open to really understanding how people think and process information. So while I talk a lot about juries and how they process information, I also mean litigators. I also mean us. We're all susceptible to these same heuristics, these same fallacies of logic and how we process information. Another question, how can attorneys use the law of least effort to simplify complex legal concepts without oversimplifying the case? I will tell you that it is hard to oversimplify a case. And I could leave it at that. If you think it is simple enough, find an 11-year-old and see if you can explain it to them. If they can come up with a simple answer and understand the issues, you've done a good enough job with simplifying the case. If you haven't, you got a lot of work to do. And the reason I use that as an example, because it forces us to simplify things with the language and how we present information, because the attention span of an 11-year-old is really short. And if you can present it to them in a minute or so, and not only they pay attention, but understand how this ought to be adjudicated, you've done a really good job. Now, remember, they're not going to pay attention to most of what we say, which is why we oversimplify. That also gives them instructions off of what evidence and experts they need to pay attention to. And if we simplify it in the correct way and we give them that narrative structure, they'll go, oh, I heard this expert say this, that reinforces that story. And now I understand how I need to vote when I go back to the jury room. It is hard to oversimplify a case. Do not be afraid of that. I rarely see that. In fact, it is usually the other direction. We fail to simplify it enough because we give people far too much credit for how much attention they're going to give us, for how they're going to process information, and for coming to conclusions because they think they're smarter than they are, because they think they understand this topic a lot more than they really do. I do have a question here. QR code for the newsletter. Apologies if I didn't have it up on screen enough. Nina, I'm sure, is going to share this with the group. We can also get out a URL so that you can sign up for that. I'd love the additional questions. And thank you for all of the additional questions. I'm going to wrap with a super fun question here at the end. How can you deal with a more attractive adversary? Ooh, good question. I would remind you that attractiveness has lots of dimensions. Some we can affect, such as the symmetry of our face. Other things we can affect based off how we look and how we interact with people. Now, we draw first impressions very quickly based off how we look, but also how we present our overall gestalt. This is something that you can test, and we can do online. As we're doing online surveys, we can do profiles, show us what you're going to wear, how you're going to interact with that audience, and who's going to open the case. All of those things do have an effect. We can also make sure that we are representative of the jury pool. If you're presenting to a jury that's going to be heavily male skewed, you don't want to have all unrelated audience. And the converse of that is true. All those dynamics come into effect, and we can affect a lot of them. Simply the things that we wear, the type of presentation that we put out. And it used to be simple, wear your nicest suit. And that's no longer the case anymore. Sometimes if we want to tell a humility story, we might want to dress down just a little bit, make us be more relatable and to be more calm and focused. And there are other dynamics you can have with your language and overall appearance that can overcome the limitation folks like me have are the symmetry of our face. You just need to be aware of it going into it and spend a little time trying to make yourself be more presentable and more likable. So there are things within your control. Guys, we've been at this a little over an hour. I want to say thank you for paying attention. I hope to hear from all of you. I love this. If you want to nerd out with me about psychology and juries, please feel free to reach out. Follow us on social media at Intermark Legal, and we will dig a little bit more. Nina?
Thank you so much, Jake, for all of your thoughtful insights, and thank you all so much for your wonderful questions. We want to thank you all for joining us for another Justia webinar. Additionally, as we mentioned earlier, don't forget to take advantage of a powerful free legal resource that's available for all Justia Connect members, our Justia Daily Opinion Summaries. You can get next day alerts with concise summaries for the latest court opinions in the jurisdictions and practice areas that matter to you. Stay informed, stay ahead. You can sign up now at newsletters.justia.com and never miss a key legal development. And have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on law practice and legal marketing. See you in our next video.